views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Coming up on this edition of Perspectives, we go front and center with the Derek Chauvin Trial. As the trial has rested, the jury is now deliberating. Questions are now being centered as to this whole process. What does it mean? How does the jury reach a verdict? Did the prosecution do its job? Did the defense do its job? Well, we've got a very special attorney who will be coming and weighing in on this and more on this edition of Perspectives with yours truly, Daren Jaime.
What's on your mind? Express what's on your mind. What's on your mind?
Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, you speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective with shines of light. Cause it might make a difference in someone else's life.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.
What's your perspective? Let them know.
And hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime. Of course, we thank you for joining us. As always, you can watch Perspectives live here on BronxNet's Channel 67. Also, we invite you to stay connected to us on our social media platforms at BronxNet TV. If you're looking for something else in terms of, guess what, website, well, BronxNet.org. For me, social media-wise, you can get me at Daren C. Jaime. That's my professional page on Facebook. And then on Twitter and Instagram, DC Jaime23. There you can get some information as well as checking out some inspiration. Just go ahead and find out more there. But listen, coming up on this edition of Perspectives, we go front and center with the Derek Chauvin Trial in the death of George Floyd. This case, not just national, but worldwide, as all eyes are literally glued to the screen, waiting for a jury verdict to come back. The prosecution is rested. The defense is rested. The question is, has the prosecution done enough to get a conviction? Has the defense done enough to create room for a reasonable doubt? Joining us now to share a little bit more and weigh in on this conversation, we are pleased to be joined by Jodi Morales. She is a criminal defense attorney in the Bronx in New York City. And Jodi, good to have you back here on Perspectives, and glad to have you sharing with us.
Thanks for having me back again.
Thank you. Well, as we are here now, of course, as I said, all of the world is watching, literally to find out in what should be an open and shut case for many people. We'll come back and talk about that in a minute. But as you watch this trial, talk to me about your reactions as a lawyer to what you saw.
Well, I had the benefit of watching the entire closing argument of both sides. And what I saw from the prosecution was a very powerful summation. I mean, he just summed up the information and the evidence in a way that was not only passionate, but complete and concise and very, very powerful, so that the jury could really understand how important it is, what their job is at this point, and why they need to take this job extremely seriously. Now, the defense delivered, a closing argument as well, which is customary. The defense is doing what it can do. There's overwhelming evidence against the defendant in my perspective, in my view. And I think the defense their strategy is to essentially poke holes, but I'm not sure that they're going to be able to do that.
Yeah, I want to tell our viewers too, if you're watching now, please understand that as this show airs, it's taped right now. A verdict has not yet come. If a verdict does come between the time we go to air, of course, we'll get Jodi back, and then we'll have another conversation, talk about it. So the beauty is, Jodi, you get two shows in one, no matter what happens here. So we thank you. But no, I want to talk a little bit more about the prosecution. Many people, as I said in the open, feel as though this should have been an open and shut case simply because you see an officer put their knee on the neck for more than 9 minutes. But the prosecution still has to be diligent in laying out their case. Talk to me about what was so compelling about what the prosecution laid out.
So what the prosecution did that was most powerful, in my view, was discuss the fact that the police department, the Minnesota Police Department, is not on trial here. Derek Chauvin is on trial, okay? This is someone who went beyond the call of duty, used unreasonable force, and that is what he needs to be held to. This is not a case where the prosecution is saying, you know what, all police officers are bad, let's convict all police officers with this trial. No, this is very specific. And I think that that's very important because you do have a number of people in that jury, in the community, in the United States who feel that, policing is a noble profession. It actually is. Police officers go out into the streets, they risk their lives, they, have to encounter many, many difficult situations. And so, villainizing the entire police force would not have been a good strategy by the prosecution.
But you couldn't villainize the whole police force because when you look at the prosecution, they actually called the defendants superiors. They've called other law enforcement officers. Mm-hmm. And so from my estimation, and I think they did a totally good job of saying, listen, this isn't a whole police force. We're not painting with a broad brush. But what we are saying is this officer, Derek Chauvin, is very much responsible. Agree?
Agreed, 100%. I mean, one of the other things that the prosecutor did beautifully was mention the motto of the Minnesota Police Department, which was to serve with courage and to protect with compassion. He used that and played on those words and said, you know what, this situation did not require courage. It was very clear from Mr. Floyd's behavior that he was not resisting, that he was not in a position to do anything to make these officers feel as though they had to use an excessive force here. And, he used that motto, bridged it to the compassion part and said, what he needed was compassion. What they had to do in this situation was show compassion to another human being who was suffering. And that in and of itself encapsulated the closing for me. I thought it was just brilliant and powerfully mentioned.
Talk to me a little bit about this. From the public perception, we saw this play out. This resulted in civil unrest, social unrest all across America. Everybody saw for 9 minutes plus the knee on the neck of George Floyd. Everybody saw this man cry out for his mother. Everybody saw the fact that you had people who were other officers who didn't even intervene. And you had emergency service personnel who couldn't do anything. To the average person, a lay person, an open and shut case. Mm-hmm. The question is, what more is going to be needed to be proven given the fact that you saw a man die, and particularly on video?
In my view, we don't need much more. I mean, the defense has to do its job. The defense has to raise doubt here, a reasonable doubt. And this is why there's all this discussion about, an enlarged heart, cardiac arrest, drug use, all of these other things are brought up because the defense already has a lot of heavy lifting to do. In my view, there is no more evidence that needs to be shown by the prosecution in order to convict. I mean, it's just overwhelming.
Well, Jodi, one of the key moments, I think, for the prosecution in their arresting of the case was talking about the heart of the matter. It talks about Derek Chauvin. And it says, first of all, George Floyd is accused of dying of having a big heart. But in the end, he says it was Derek Chauvin that had a small heart. How powerful was that for the prosecution?
Now, that's an incredibly powerful moment. When a jury is deliberating, they have a lot of information, a lot of evidence that they have to sort through. And in a case like this, where you've heard testimony from numerous medical experts, it becomes very difficult for the jury to kind of keep it all together in their heads and really focus in on what the evidence is. And so the job of the attorney and the job of the prosecutor in this case is to wrap it all up, bring it home, and really hone in on the heart of the matter, which is the underlying cause of death in this case. It was not drug abuse. It was not cardiac arrest. It was very clearly determined that this was a homicide at the hands of the defendant.
Yeah. And before we go to break, I want to ask this question about the family of George Floyd, his brother testifying on the stand. Giving a personal view of George Floyd, from a prosecution point of view, how effective a strategy is this, bringing the defendant's brother to the stand?
Oh, again, it's a very effective strategy. We have to humanize somebody who's no longer with us. All we know of George Floyd are those moments that have been broadcast all over the news for about a year now. We don't know who he is as a man. Who he was as a man was somebody who was beneficial to society, who had a family, who was at the helm of his family, someone that people really needed to understand in terms of deciding the outcome in this case. Bringing his brother in to give those anecdotes and to give that perspective is probably one of the most powerful things that the prosecutor could do.
I want to come back after the break and talk a little bit in your area, Jodi. We're going to talk about criminal defense. We'll take a look from the defense perspective. How has the defense actually done in this trial? We'll take a look at that and more here on Perspectives. We're back here on Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you. Our guest, criminal defense attorney Jodi Morales. She's breaking down for us what we saw in the case against Derek Chauvin. Has the prosecution done enough to get a conviction? Well, as of this show, a verdict has not yet been reached. The purpose of the show is really to break down what we've seen in the trial thus far. Now, if a verdict does come between the time that we actually air the show, what happens is bring Jodi back. We talk about the verdict. We talk about the case from another perspective. But as of right now, no verdict has actually been reached. And Jodi, with the jury out at deliberation right now, I guess the big question is, how did the defense fare? I mean, when you think about it, an overwhelming, compelling amount of evidence. But as a defense attorney, I get it. You have to do your job, right? So how did he fare?
Certainly, I think that this was heavy lifting from the beginning. Now, of course, the defense has no burden of proof. The burden is always on the prosecution. But when you have evidence this clear for everyone to see, the defense does have to lift a lot of weight here. They did what they could do. The defense team did the best that they could. They raised doubt by calling into question Mr. Floyd's use of opioids and other underlying health problems. But at the end of the day, I just don't see it. I don't see how a jury could not convict when you have that video.
Yeah. And talk to us about the defense strategy. I mean, obviously on the prosecution side, we saw multiple people from the prosecution actually go forward and do their job. When it comes from the defense, it seems as though we only had one lawyer. Should we take anything away from that?
No, it's not about the lawyer's performance. Really, at the end of the day, the jury has to weigh the evidence, right? I mean, Mr. Chauvin has the right not to testify, the right to remain silent, and he exercised that right. And I think that from a defense perspective, that was the right thing to do. We know that he had some history of misconduct. Had he taken the stand, though some of those, at least some of them, would have come in. And that would have, of course, cast an even worse shadow on the defendant. So, it's the type of thing where it's less is more here. Again, we have this video. That really is the critical piece of evidence. And I think that's what the case rests on.
Yeah. But when we look at the defense, the question is, who has the advantage here? Some people say the prosecution has the advantage because you got the video. But from a defense purpose, all it takes is one for there not to be a conviction. How powerful is that?
Well, I mean, we have to wait for a unanimous verdict, right? If we have one holdout and, this goes on for a very long time, the judge may declare a mistrial. We don't know what will happen. But if we're talking about, weighing who has power at this stage of the game, I think it's fair to say that the prosecution has, a lot more power in this situation. They have the evidence of this video. They have medical testimony. They have experts that testified about use of force. And I think all of that really does just prove their case.
Yeah. But then when you think about, as a defense attorney, all I have to do is really just turn one mind. If I turn one mind or cause enough question amongst one, for all intents and purposes, we walk away winning.
Well, you have to turn that one person's mind, and then that person has to infect the rest of the jurors, and turn their minds. So of course, that the strategy from a defense perspective in a case like this is to get at least someone to feel like there's a reasonable doubt as to the cause of death here. But whether you're going to have an entire jury agree with that one juror, I highly doubt it.
I almost hate to ask this question, but I have to be objective as a journalist and ask this. But where did the defense really do a good job from your perspective?
I think they did a good job by raising an alternative cause of death. I mean, they did what they had to do, which was to say, look, there was evidence of drug use and there was evidence of heart disease. From a medical perspective, I mean, if we're looking at it from a scientific view, that seems like, an objective defense. It seems like something that is plausible and a contributing factor. And I think that that's what they had to work with, and that's what they did. And that's kind of all they could do.
Walk us through. I mean, many of us do not have, a lot of us have been called to jury duty. Many of us have been told, listen, we don't need you. But for those people who are actually called to the jury, walk us through what a jury is going through in a time such as this.
So the jury is going through a lot right now. My understanding is that the judge has sequestered them. They are deliberating, which means that they are sorting through all of the evidence that was presented during the trial. They are discussing the case. They are, doing their job. I mean, it's really, they're the most important people in this case at this point. Jury duty can be a little bit tiresome for people. Most people don't want to do it, but it really, really is important. It's something that all of us benefit from, understanding our legal system and understanding why participating in it actually helps all of us as community members.
Yeah. A lot of people have weighed in on this conversation, and not even the conversation, but just this trial as a whole. Everybody from Maxine Waters all the way down to President Joe Biden. I'll start by saying this, Maxine Waters saying that if things do not go right, there should be a taking to the streets. The judge saying, listen, this could be grounds for an appeal on the part of the defense. Walk us through exactly what, from a legal perspective, what is the judge really talking about with regards to the grounds here as far as Congressman Waters' speech?
Well, I think that she shouldn't have said what she said. I think that already places an influence on the jury as they're deliberating. And, we don't want a jury deliberating with pressure from someone in a political position of power. The appellate issue could rise right from there. I mean, those words could make jurors kind of, instead of focusing on the evidence, focus again on the external pressures. And that in and of itself is enough to really call into question the verdict in this case.
Even though they're being sequestered, that would still be enough to get to bring them out? Well,
even though the judge has ruled that they are not, that they're not supposed to be out and talking about these things. I mean, we're human beings. We're on our phones all the time. I mean, sometimes you hear information in passing, and that can influence your decision making. So I think that, the comments made were a little problematic from that perspective.
Yeah. Well, you've got President Joe Biden who's made some comments, and he says he hopes that the jury does the right thing. How can we interpret that?
Well, I think he was very careful and smart to say the right thing. I mean, my assumption is that he's hoping that all of the processes that have been put in place in a legal case are followed, and that the jury is actually following the judge's instructions and that they're deliberating based on the evidence as it was presented to them.
Yeah. very interesting to see a president, Congress, and really the whole world really riding out, on this verdict. From your perspective, what you saw, is there anything that either side could have done better?
I can't say that the prosecution did anything wrong in my view. What I loved about the prosecution's presentation is that there was no spin here. There was no need to spin anything. It was just the facts as they unfolded and presented in front of the jurors. I think where the defense lost a little credibility was in trying to spin this testimony about the underlying drug use and the heart problems. If I were defending Mr. Chauvin, I don't know that I would have emphasized as much on this drug abuse issue. I think that really does turn people off because it's so clear that, this wasn't an overdose. I think the evidence was very clear of that. And once you start pushing too far away from what the expert testimony is, you really do start to look like you're not being forthcoming with the jury.
Take a quick break. Back with more with Jodi Morales, criminal defense attorney, as we talk about the case of Derek Chauvin and the death of George Floyd. Be back in a few right after this. And we're back here with Jodi Morales, criminal defense attorney, as we are talking more about the trial of Derek Chauvin and the death of George Floyd. As we said from the beginning of this show, as of right now, the time that this show airs, a verdict has not been reached. Now, if a verdict does happen to reach between the time that we've taped and the time that we air, of course, we bring Jodi back. We have another conversation talking about the verdict and the way things shaped out. But as of right now, no verdict. We're just really discussing what we've seen in the trial thus far to get us to where we are. Now, Jodi, I'll bring you in and ask the question about what can we expect. The world is watching. Community is watching. As we talk about Minneapolis schools have gone virtual right now in anticipation of a verdict being handed up. What can we expect?
I think either way, we're going to have a lot of people feeling very, very disheartened. Okay. I think that the one great thing that came out of this tragedy is watching people take to the streets, watching people band together and actually pay even closer attention to the legal process and really feel it's important to hear their voices be heard. I think what we can anticipate with the verdict here is, this feeling of, okay, maybe there is a conviction. We're happy about that, but nothing is going to bring this man back. And that's where that disheartened feeling comes from. Of course, you have folks on the opposite end of the spectrum who feel that, the defendant should be acquitted. Those folks are also feeling their own things, their own anxieties about this process, particularly because police officers do find themselves in very difficult situations, do sacrifice their lives day in and day out. So, the tension there is going to be palpable regardless of the outcome.
When you look at it from a criminal defense attorney's perspective, I would say not even a criminal defense attorney's perspective. How about from an attorney's perspective? Because while the public is watching, I know that everybody in the legal world is watching. So as a person that is a legal analyst, both on TV, right, and sitting at your home and watching just as an independent person, what are you looking for and what are you paying attention to from a lawyer's perspective about this whole trial?
Well, I was looking for the prosecution to present this case in a very fact-specific, forward manner. And by that, I mean presenting the evidence as it unfolded, as they had it. And that is exactly what they did. I think sometimes, defense attorneys feel like the prosecution is maybe not being, as honest as they can be in certain situations. It's common knowledge in the United States that, certain prosecutors' offices have withheld evidence and, things like that. Those are issues in and of themselves. But what I really appreciated about this prosecutor's presentation is that it was just, here's the evidence, here's what it is, use your common sense, members of the jury, and find in favor of the prosecution. They met their burden. From the defense perspective, I was looking for a little bit more of a credible presentation to the defense. Again, it's a really difficult defense here. It's a very, very hard defense, and they did what they could do. But again, I think that there are nuances, there are ways to temper your arguments so that you don't come off as an incredible person or lawyer.
Yeah. Convicting a police officer, very hard. We look at New York State, it's tremendously hard. I remember, and I date back as far as Francis Lavoti and the Anthony Baez case, and trying to get a conviction, where we heard I was there, it was a Friday, Judge Gerald Shineland said, I do believe that he did not tell the truth, but I don't believe that there's enough evidence to convict. And from that point forward, a lot of people have always said convicting a police officer is ultimately the hardest thing to do. How hard will this be, given the fact with the jury still being out right now? How hard do you think this will be?
Well, again, what I thought the prosecutor did a beautiful job of was making the distinction that a police officer is not on trial here, okay? An individual who overstepped a huge boundary is on trial here. Taking it outside of the realm of the Minnesota Police Department was probably the strongest argument that the prosecutor could make. And I think that allows the jury some room, some flexibility, so that they don't feel like they are, prosecuting a cop. They're prosecuting someone who committed a crime.
Great work, Jodi. Thank you so much for being with us here on Perspectives. Your perspective really has helped to shed some light on some things, and thank you so much for being with us. And of course, when the verdict is handed down, love for you to be back with us.
I'd love to. Thank you.
All righty, Jodi Morales, our guest here on Perspectives. We are wrapping things up here. And of course, as we said, this show has been taped right prior to a verdict being announced. If in the process that a verdict is actually announced, we will come back with another show and bring Jodi back on. But certainly riveting television, certainly painful television. And as President Joe Biden says, we pray that the jury does the right thing. That's my perspective tonight. So for all of us here on the Seven Perspectives, thank you so much for watching. Until next time we meet, stay safe. I'm Daren Jaime saying share your perspective with somebody else. You just don't know. It might make a difference in somebody else's life. Take care.